Long before the Renaissance lit the lamps of Europe, a dazzling civilization was already ablaze with knowledge, innovation, and unmatched power. This is the untold story of the Abbasid Caliphate, the empire that transformed the ancient world and laid the foundation for the modern one. From the golden domes of Baghdad to the marble halls of the House of Wisdom, the Abbasids didn't just rule, they revolutionized. Scientists, philosophers, poets, and engineers from every corner of the known world gathered under one banner, driven by a shared hunger for discovery. Paper-making secrets smuggled from China, the birth of algebra, breakthroughs in medicine, astronomy, and literature. All of it began here. But how did a dynasty rise from the sands of revolution to become the world's first true super-empire of both intellect and influence? And what secrets did it carry to its fall? In this epic historical journey, we unravel the power plays, the cultural explosion, and the brilliant minds that turned the Abbasid Caliphate into a beacon for humanity. Prepare to discover how knowledge became power, and how that power changed the world. Watch now and step inside the empire that redefined civilization. They weren't born into power, they seized it. The Abbasids emerged from the shadows of empire, a secret movement rising in the east, plotting the fall of a dynasty that had stretched from Spain to India. To understand the Abbasids, you have to understand the world they inherited and the world they wanted to replace. By the early 8th century, the Umayyad Caliphate was an empire in decline. Born in Damascus, the Umayyads had rapidly expanded the Islamic world, but their rule was brittle. Their Arab-centric policies alienated non-Arab Muslims, Persians, Berbers, and others who felt marginalized in the very empire they helped build. Economic inequality festered, political unrest simmered. The Abbasids, descendants of the Prophet's uncle Al-Abbas, positioned themselves as the answer, not just a rebellion, but a revolution. Their revolution was masterful, orchestrated in secret from Khorasan, in what is now northeastern Iran. The Abbasid movement blended Islamic legitimacy with populist messaging. They promised justice, they promised equality, and most crucially, they promised inclusion for all Muslims, regardless of race or origin. It worked. With Persian backing and a wave of discontent behind them, they launched the Abbasid Revolution. In 750 CE, it all exploded. The Battle of the Zab River sealed the fate of the Umayyads. The Abbasids crushed the ruling dynasty, slaughtered most of its family, and declared a new era. One Umayyad prince, Abd al-Rahman, escaped to Spain, planting the seed for a rival emirate in Cordoba. But in the heart of the Islamic world, the Abbasids were now in charge. Their capital would not be Damascus. They dreamed bigger, much bigger. The Abbasids didn't just want to rule an empire, they wanted to reshape it. To legitimize their power, they wrapped themselves in the symbolism of the Prophet's family. But beneath the religious imagery was something deeper, a civilizational vision. They didn't just move the capital, they reimagined its soul. Damascus was a garrison city. Baghdad, their new creation, would be something else entirely, a city of culture, commerce, and cosmic design. The transition wasn't just geographic, it was philosophical. The Abbasids ushered in Persian administrators, adopted court rituals from ancient empires, and opened their doors to scientists, poets, and philosophers from across the known world. Where the Umayyads had ruled with a sword, the Abbasids would try to rule with a pen, at least at first. This was the dawn of something unprecedented, the Islamic Golden Age. But golden ages don't just happen, they are built, forged in the fire of ambition, policy, and vision. In the next chapter, we witness how a patch of marshland along the Tigris River would become the brightest city on earth, a place where knowledge, trade, and power converged like never before. The year was 762 CE. On the banks of the Tigris River, Caliph al-Mansur stood surveying a patch of land that would soon defy the imagination. This wasn't just urban planning. It was political theater, spiritual symbolism, and imperial ambition fused into stone. The Abbasids weren't just founding a city, they were building a new world. Baghdad wasn't chosen by accident. Al-Mansur knew geography was power. The site was strategically placed between the trade routes of Persia, India, and the Mediterranean. It was a meeting point of cultures, goods, and ideas. It offered access to rivers, roads, and riches. But even more, it was a blank slate, a chance to design a city unlike anything before. And what a design it was! Circular, symmetrical, and breathtaking. Baghdad was conceived as a perfectly round city, a geometric marvel inspired by Persian urban planning and cosmic harmony. At its center, the Golden Gate Palace, surrounded by government buildings, mosques, and residences. Radiating outward were markets, neighborhoods, and gardens. It wasn't just beautiful, it was a message. This was the center of the world, and the Caliph its axis. Construction drew engineers, architects, laborers, and scholars from across the empire. The city grew rapidly. Within a few decades, it had become the largest city in the world, a glittering metropolis of over 1 million people. Baghdad buzzed with life, merchants shouting prices, philosophers debating truth, and astronomers charting the heavens. It was a symphony of civilization. But what made Baghdad truly revolutionary wasn't its layout, it was its mindset. Al-Mansur and his successors didn't just tolerate diversity, they cultivated it. Christians translated Greek texts into Arabic. Jews contributed to science and medicine. Persians brought administrative genius. Indians shared mathematical wonders. The city became a living library of humanity, a place where knowledge wasn't just stored, it was synthesized. Baghdad wasn't just a capital, it was a canvas of dreams. Here, in the shadow of golden domes and spiraling minarets, the Abbasids weren't just managing an empire, they were sculpting a civilization, but even they couldn't imagine how brightly it would shine, nor how quickly its light would spread. In the next chapter, we step inside the mind of that civilization, into the libraries, schools, and laboratories of the House of Wisdom. There are moments in history when a civilization doesn't just survive, it soars. The Abbasid Caliphate, at its intellectual peak, lit a fire in the human mind, and its brightest flame burned in a place called Bait al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. Established in the early 9th century by Caliph Harun al-Rashid and expanded under his son, al-Mamun, the House of Wisdom wasn't just a library. It was a powerhouse of research, translation, experimentation, and innovation. Scientists, philosophers, mathematicians, translators, and poets gathered under one roof from every corner of the Abbasid realm and beyond, united by one mission: to know everything. Here, ancient texts from Greece, Persia, India, and Egypt were translated into Arabic with breathtaking urgency. Aristotle, Galen, Euclid, and Ptolemy were resurrected in a new tongue, but it wasn't just copying, it was transformation. Abbasid scholars didn't just inherit knowledge, they questioned it, improved it, expanded it. They invented algorithms, refined the scientific method, pioneered algebra, mapped the stars, and debated the nature of existence. Figures like Al-Khwarizmi, the father of algebra, revolutionized mathematics. His works introduced the decimal positional number system to the Islamic world, and eventually to Europe. Ibn Sina, Avicenna, authored the Canon of Medicine, which became a foundational medical text in both the East and West for centuries. Alhazen laid the groundwork for optics and empirical science. The list goes on, and it's astonishing. What fueled this explosion? Several things. The Abbasids' open attitude toward foreign knowledge, their patronage of scholars, the cross-cultural interactions within Baghdad, and the use of Arabic as a unifying scholarly language. But at the core was a belief that knowledge, whether sacred or secular, was a divine pursuit. In an age when others burned books, the Abbasids built temples to them. The ripple effect of the House of Wisdom was massive. It preserved the intellectual heritage of antiquity, sparked new scientific revolutions, and laid the foundations for the European Renaissance centuries later. But even more, it redefined what a capital could be, not just a seat of political power, but a beacon of intellectual power. This wasn't just the golden age of Islam. It was one of the brightest moments in human history. But no empire thrives on ideas alone. To sustain greatness, the Abbasids had to trade, manage, and rule on a global scale. And that's where we're headed next. Baghdad didn't just sit at the center of an empire. It pulsed at the heart of a global web. The Abbasid Caliphate transformed the Islamic world into the most interconnected civilization of its time, where spices, silk, stories, and scientific formulas flowed across continents like blood through veins. If knowledge was the Abbasid soul, trade was their lifeblood. At its height, the Abbasid economy stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Caravans crossed the Sahara. Ships sailed from Basra to China. Coins minted in Baghdad ended up in Viking hordes. Merchants carried goods, yes, but they also carried culture. Through this constant movement, the Abbasids absorbed and exported ideas, cuisines, languages, and technologies. It wasn't just commerce, it was globalization, 1,200 years before the internet. And it was diverse, astonishingly so. In Abbasid cities, you could hear Arabic, Persian, Greek, Hebrew, Turkish, and Chinese spoken in a single market. You could eat Indian spices cooked in Persian styles or read poetry that fused Islamic themes with Roman forms. The Abbasid court itself was a mosaic of cultures: Persian viziers, Turkic generals, Christian translators, Jewish physicians. This empire didn't erase differences. It thrived on them. Art exploded. Calligraphy, ceramic tiles, textiles, and glasswork reached new levels of sophistication. Mosques blended Byzantine domes with Persian arches. Arabic became the lingua franca of philosophy and science, but it absorbed the rhythms of other tongues. Music evolved too, incorporating instruments and modes from India and Central Asia. This wasn't just cultural fusion, it was cultural alchemy. Trade also gave the Abbasids something else: power. By taxing goods moving along the Silk Road and controlling strategic ports and land routes, they became wealthy beyond comparison. Their coinage, especially the gold dinar and silver dirham, became trusted currencies across continents. Their administrative systems, built on Persian models, kept the machine running. It wasn't just faith that united the caliphate, it was function. But with reach comes risk. The more complex the empire became, the more vulnerable it was to internal tensions, external pressures, and economic strain. Still, in these golden centuries, the Abbasids proved something revolutionary: that an empire built on ideas and openness could dominate the world stage. But dominance required more than wealth and wisdom. It needed order and muscle. In the next chapter, we examine the military engine and political machinery that powered this sprawling empire, and the cracks that would soon begin to show. Beneath the glittering intellect of the Abbasid Golden Age lurked a darker truth. Ideas might build empires, but only power sustains them. The Abbasid caliphs, for all their cultural refinement, ruled an empire that spanned continents. And empires that big don't stay peaceful for long. Behind every scroll and poem was a sword, and behind every caliph, someone else often pulled the strings. Early on, the Abbasids ruled with a sense of moral mission, but maintaining control over such a vast and diverse territory, from Morocco to India, required more than vision. It required bureaucratic genius, relentless taxation, and a loyal military. The Persian vizierate system became the backbone of Abbasid administration, giving the caliphate stability and structure, but it also opened the door to factionalism and palace intrigue. As the centuries passed, real power often shifted away from the caliphs themselves. Military leaders, provincial governors, and even foreign mercenaries began to dominate politics. The most notorious were the Turkic slave soldiers, or Mamluks, initially recruited for their loyalty, later feared for their power. These men, trained from youth to serve the caliph, eventually became kingmakers, and sometimes king-breakers. The caliphs, once figures of immense authority, were increasingly isolated behind palace walls. Rivalries erupted between factions at court. Civil wars, like the devastating Fourth Fitna between Al-Amin and Al-Mamun, tore the empire apart from within. Provinces like Egypt and Al-Andalus began slipping out of control, ruled more in name than in practice. The Abbasid grip was weakening, even as the empire's cultural prestige remained strong. To maintain their rule, the Abbasids doubled down on symbolism. The caliph became a semi-divine figure, a shadow of God on earth. Ceremonies grew elaborate, palaces became fortresses. The court projected grandeur, but behind it, rot was setting in. Corruption spread, rebellions flared. The military, once the empire's shield, became a dagger pointed inward. Yet through all this, the machinery of empire kept turning. Trade continued, learning flourished. Religion remained a unifying force, but the balance was delicate, and as power fractured, the edges began to crumble. The caliphate was still standing, but no longer invincible, and as the light of unity dimmed, a storm was gathering far to the east, one that would bring fire, ruin, and the end of an era. Next, the beginning of the end. Great empires rarely fall overnight. They unravel. And for the Abbasids, the unraveling came in waves, slow, uneven, but irreversible. Beneath the brilliance of Baghdad and the poetry of the court, the very foundation of Abbasid power had begun to splinter. The first cracks came from within. The vastness of the empire, once its strength, became a liability. Provinces gained autonomy. Governors stopped sending taxes. Some declared independence entirely. In the west, the Umayyads reemerged in Spain. In the east, breakaway dynasties like the Samanids and Buyids ruled with little regard for the caliph in Baghdad. The once centralized empire was becoming a patchwork of rivals and rebels. Even Baghdad itself was no longer safe. The power struggles within the court turned violent. Assassinations, coups, and puppet caliphs became all too common. The Mamluks, those foreign slave soldiers once trusted for their loyalty, grew bolder, turning against their masters. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were political players, often more powerful than the caliphs they were meant to protect. Economically, the empire began to stagnate. Trade routes shifted. Inflation soared. Infrastructure crumbled. The Tigris and Euphrates, lifelines of the region, began to flood unpredictably, destroying farmland and displacing populations. Famine and disease crept in. The once bustling markets of Baghdad now echoed with uncertainty. Religiously, the unity of Islam fractured. The Sunni-Shia divide deepened. The rise of new theological schools sparked fierce debate and sometimes violent conflict. The Abbasids, who had once claimed legitimacy through descent from the Prophet's family, now struggled to maintain their moral authority. The caliph was still revered, but his word no longer carried the weight it once did. In response, the Abbasids tried to adapt. They allied with the Buyids, a Shia dynasty, even as they ruled a mostly Sunni population. Later, they turned to the Seljuk Turks, inviting them in as protectors. It worked, temporarily. The Seljuks revived Sunni orthodoxy and stabilized the region. But once again, real power lay elsewhere. The caliph was now a figurehead in his own palace. By the 12th century, the Abbasid realm was a shadow of its former self. Baghdad still stood. Scholars still wrote. Mosques still echoed with prayer. But the empire's golden aura had dimmed. And on the steppes of Asia, a force unlike any the world had seen was rising. One that would bring not just decline, but destruction. The Mongols were coming. The Abbasids had weathered rebellions, assassinations, and centuries of slow decay, but nothing prepared them for what thundered out of the east in the mid-13th century. The Mongols weren't just another army, they were a storm, precise, relentless, and merciless. And in 1258 CE, that storm slammed into Baghdad. The Mongol Empire, under Genghis Khan and his descendants, had reshaped the map of Asia. By the time his grandson, Hulagu Khan, turned his attention to the Islamic world, he had already crushed Persia and destroyed the fabled assassins of Alamut. His next target was the symbolic heart of the Muslim world, Baghdad, still rich in reputation, if not in power. Caliph al-Mustasim, the last of the Abbasids, underestimated the threat. He hesitated, he miscalculated, and he failed to muster a defense worthy of the city's legacy. Diplomacy collapsed. The Mongol army, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, encircled Baghdad in January 1258. The siege began. It lasted just 2 weeks. Then came the unthinkable. On February 10th, the Mongols breached the walls. What followed was one of the most catastrophic sackings in human history. The invaders looted, raped, and massacred. Estimates range from 100,000 to over 1 million people killed. The House of Wisdom, centuries of irreplaceable knowledge, was thrown into the Tigris River. For days, the river ran black with ink and red with blood. The Mongols executed the caliph, rolling him in a carpet and trampling him with horses, a method designed to avoid shedding royal blood. It was a symbolic death for a symbolic empire. The Abbasids, rulers of the Islamic world for over 500 years, were no more. The city that had once dazzled the world was left in ruins, silent, scorched, and broken. The fall of Baghdad sent shockwaves across the Islamic world. It was more than a military defeat. It was a civilizational trauma. A golden age had ended, not with a slow fade, but with fire and steel. The Mongols moved on, and the world changed forever. But the Abbasid name and legacy refused to vanish completely. In the ashes of Baghdad, a new world would slowly emerge, and in Cairo, a symbolic caliphate would rise again. The Abbasids were gone, but their light had not fully extinguished. Empires rise, empires fall, but some leave behind echoes so powerful they shape the world long after the banners have dropped and the palaces have crumbled. The Abbasids were one such empire. Though their political power ended in the ruins of Baghdad, their influence is everywhere. In science, in language, in law, in culture, and in the very idea of what a civilization can be. The Abbasid Golden Age helped preserve the ancient world and birth the modern one. It was Abbasid scholars who translated Greek philosophy into Arabic, preserving it when Europe had largely forgotten it. Later, during the Renaissance, those same works would be translated again from Arabic into Latin and reignite the West's intellectual flame. Without the Abbasids, Aristotle might have remained buried. Algebra might never have traveled west. The compass of modernity might have spun off course. The Abbasids redefined what a capital could be. Baghdad was not just a seat of power, It was a sanctuary for scholars, a crossroads of cultures, a beacon of light in an age often mischaracterized as dark. The model they created, a multicultural, knowledge-based urban center, would be replicated for centuries to come, from Moorish Cordoba to Mughal Delhi. Even their mistakes shaped the future. The rise of Mamluks, the splintering of provinces, the conflicts between Sunni and Shia, all these elements echoed into future Islamic empires. The Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals all navigated the systems and the scars left behind by Abbasid rule. In Cairo, the Abbasid name continued symbolically under the Mamluks. Though stripped of real power, the caliphate title still held spiritual significance, a reminder of a once mighty legacy. It wasn't until the early 20th century, when the Ottomans abolished the caliphate, that the Abbasid dream was finally put to rest. And yet, here we are, still talking about them, still in awe of what they built, still learning from what they left behind. In an age where civilizations clash and ideas are politicized, the Abbasid story reminds us that greatness doesn't come from conquest alone. It comes from curiosity, tolerance, and the audacity to imagine a better world. They called it the Golden Age, not just for its wealth or its warriors, but for the brilliance of its mind. The Abbasids lit up the world, and some lights, once lit, never truly go out.